Israel is a giant albatross around their neck, both strategically and morally. He didn't have to talk to the Mossad agents. All he had to do was talk to John Ratcliffe, who, as you said, is effectively a Mossad agent.
So recently, John Mearsheimer went on Andrew Napolitano's podcast and talked a little bit about how Israel's government controls the U.S. intelligence community, how the Israel lobby plays into this, and Mearsheimer wrote the book literally on the Israel lobby and what we can learn about and who it is within the Trump administration that's facilitating this arrangement. So let's check out what he has to say, and please like this video and subscribe to the channel.
The claims in this are absurd. I invite your attention to two parts of it. One, he talks about a conference with intelligence people in which he and other senators were briefed. He lists the briefer. Listen for a name that is conspicuously missing. And then there's a very short question and a 3-word answer at the end. The last 3 words you'll hear in this clip. And I invite your attention to that. Chris, cut number 7.
Before Israel and America did what we did, Iran was within days of having a nuclear weapon. Now
within days?
Within days.
That's what they told you in this briefing?
Within days.
Sir, just to kind of circle back and put a finer point on this, the days that they were to getting a bomb, that seems to be different from what Tulsi Gabbard had testified to in March. Was there a new assessment? Was that the Israeli assessment? Was that a new American assessment? Was that information new to you in this briefing?
It was new to me. This was a good briefing. It was one of the best I've ever attended. I mean, Rubio, Hegseth, Ratcliffe, General Kane, they didn't bring out a script and read carefully from it. They just looked us in the eye and talked to us.
The assessment that said that Iran was within days of having a bomb, is that Israeli or American assessment?
I don't know.
Is that an Israeli or an American assessment? I don't know.
Well, we know from the Gray Zone reporting on this that it is from Israeli intelligence, and Max Blumenthal, thanks to him, props to him, reported that there were Mossad agents within the cabinet rooms that Trump was meeting with key administrative officials when deciding how to conduct this strike. So let's see what Mearsheimer says about it.
Did you ask, Senator? Apparently not. Have you ever heard this nonsense before? Within days? Have you ever heard of a briefing? No notes, no chart, nothing written, just talking. Have you ever heard of a briefing where the chief United States briefer under federal law, called the Director of National Intelligence, in this case Tulsi Gabbard, wasn't there?
Well, we know it's not surprising that Tulsi Gabbard wasn't there because they don't trust her and they don't want her around to have to speak out about where exactly the Iranian nuclear program is, because she would definitely have to say that they are not a few days away from having a bomb. It's a ludicrous claim. It's just, it's hard to understand where we are as a country when you have important figures from the executive branch who are going before Congress and making these ludicrous claims. Everybody knows that it will take at least a year for the Iranians to build a bomb, right? The idea that they're days away is just simply crazy, right? And then with regard to the end of the clip and the senator's comment that he didn't know whether it was Israeli or American intelligence, in a way, I don't blame him because there's no difference.
It does seem to be indistinguishable, right? U.S. intelligence compared to Israeli intelligence. The Mossad and CIA say and propagandize in the exact same way. But he's right. It's telling that Tulsi Gabbard wasn't in this briefing. She is the czar, the National Intelligence Director above all this stuff. She's the one that's in charge of all of the intelligence institutions and agencies collecting that information and having, a definitive judgment upon what the status is of all this intelligence. And we know from her testimony about 8 weeks ago, Iran didn't have a nuclear weapon and they hadn't even reconstituted their nuclear program. Well, just days before the strike, she came on Twitter and said they were weeks away. But we have now learned since that is due to Israeli intelligence that came in essentially that exact moment. It seemed to have been timed to, propagandize America into, getting involved in this war directly, bombing those 3 nuclear sites. And, he is also right here, Mearsheimer, when he talks about how even if the Iranians were able to enrich uranium up to 90%, it would take significant time to build it onto a bomb and place it onto a ballistic missile, which, by the way, they don't have the delivery capacity to even hit America. But that's the thing. This time frame could be anywhere from, I've seen estimates from 6 months to a year. So he's totally right about this. This was drummed up for propaganda, and Tulsi not appearing in this briefing is significant.
It's not like the United States is saying one thing and Israel is saying another. Certainly when you're dealing with people at the top. It's quite clear that Mossad, the leadership of Mossad and the leadership of the CIA sing from the same page. So obviously the senator who, has bought in to what is the conventional wisdom on all these subjects and believes all these people, he just repeated what they had to say, and he had no interest in trying to figure out whether it was something the Americans believed or the Israelis believed. Again, it just doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter because it's so indistinguishable, but you'd think if your job is a senator to represent the people of your state, it used to actually be your state governor before senators were directly elected by their constituents. I mean, don't get me wrong, the real constituents are JP Morgan and Raytheon, but, ostensibly it's the people that elect them. Isn't your job to ask these most basic questions about where the intelligence comes from? Was it individually sourced? Did we get some kind of, on the ground agent to confirm this? Someone within that government that's acting as, someone that's an informant to the U.S. government. These kinds of questions, they just sit back and take them for granted, mostly because they're not designed to be presented in a way to allow for pushback. They're presented in a way to propagandize the U.S. government to go along with the foreign policy nightmares that have been so commonly done throughout the presidencies of Bush and Obama and Clinton and, Biden and Trump. All throughout my life, basically the same foreign policy diagnosis and policy.
Is the director of Central Intelligence a Mossad asset?
Oh, he is. He's not a Mossad asset in the sense that he's a secret Mossad asset. He's a Mossad asset in the sense that he does Israel's bidding. He's the Israelis basically own him. It's very clear. Max Blumenthal has laid this all out for you on the show. And
Max calls him the Mossad stenographer. He takes down everything that they tell him.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it just, again, highlights that at the higher levels, there's really no meaningful difference between Israeli views and American views on all these things. By the way, I wouldn't be surprised if one of the reasons that Trump attacked on June 22nd was because he bought into this whole argument that the Iranians were a few days away from having a bomb, and it was imperative to destroy this capability before they got the bomb. Maybe that's the attack.
And it's incredible, too, because of how long it would take to actually build the bomb, which no one said they've ever tried to do, like a significant amount of time, as in not 3 months, the time between which Tulsi Gabbard presented her annual threat summary, and then this new report came in, timed on the exact occasion that the U.S. was prepared to enter this war. So, Mearsheimer's right. They sing from the same page, the Mossad and CIA, to drum up this propaganda. And the too long didn't read about Max Blumenthal's essay was how John Ratcliffe, who's the CIA director, facilitated as kind of the catalyst, bringing Mossad agents into the room with Trump, giving him their information and kind of their perspective on Iran's nuclear capabilities, and seems to have, pushed Trump over the edge to some extent when it comes to bombing them. Something that Trump's, lambasted Biden for bombing Iran. He also lambasted, Biden for bombing Yemen, and that's exactly what he did back in March for about a month straight. So Mearsheimer's right here. That article is great. John Ratcliffe really is a criminal in so many ways, and you don't hear his name repeated too often when it comes to Trump cabinet members, but he was also responsible for essentially being the chief architect of expanding FISA 702 in Congress. And FISA 702 is a program that perverts the Fourth Amendment and engages in warrantless surveillance of Americans, so they can designate foreign people that they think are a terrorist. And if you happen to be an American who doesn't know about this designation and has the bad luck of corresponding with one of these people, your person's papers and effects can be searched and seized by government without a warrant. That's a perversion of the Fourth Amendment. So that's who Ratcliffe is, and he's a rat. That's what he is.
I've gotten that argument from the Mossad agents, according to Max Blumenthal, who visited him in the Oval Office.
That may be true, but even so, he didn't have to talk to the Mossad agents. All he had to do was talk to John Ratcliffe, who, as you said, is effectively a Mossad agent.
Right.
And
There's no
it's
difference.
not only Ratcliffe, it's people like Rubio who have bought into this. You want to remember that Marco Rubio wants to be president someday. And he knows that if you want to be president someday, what you have to do is you have to kowtow to Israel.
Yeah, you can't be little Marco anymore. You have to be Zionist Marco and do whatever Netanyahu bids you to do, no matter what. Exercise no independent judgment whatsoever, bow to the military-industrial complex and the Israel lobby, and carry out the foreign policy designated by those two entities.
Oh, but Marco Rubio was born of parents who were not American citizens. And under Trump's interpretation of the 14th Amendment, he's not an American citizen. I'm being a little snarky, even though the statements I've made about this are true. How badly was the Israeli defense industry in Israel damaged by the retaliation from the Iranian missiles? Do we know?
No, we don't have any details. There's no question that a number of sites were hit. Air bases were hit. Research institutions were hit. They ran out of they were running out of defensive missiles, as we know. So damage was done. And of course, damage was done to all sorts of buildings, both military buildings and civilian buildings inside of Tel Aviv. And then in Haifa, they hit the port. They did enormous damage to the one of the two oil refineries that the Israelis have. So the Iranians did an enormous amount of damage inside of Israel. But there's no evidence that they eliminated any meaningful slice of Israel's defensive capabilities.
That's right. Some of their missiles got through the Iron Dome, did some damage. I think a few dozen Israelis did die. Israel, on the other hand, did take out about 600 Iranians, it seems like. And they went straight for, just as in Gaza, civilians. That's the first strike they made. Residential complexes in Tehran. Ostensibly, again, it was to take out some of the high brass in Iran. But also, if you happen to be one of those poor souls that lived in the same complex, well, you were just dead anyways because of this stupid war that was counterintuitive and remains counterintuitive. So he's right about that. We saw some strikes on Israel, but, the extent to which that, damaged their strategic ability to defend themselves, I guess, is up for interpretation. But I do think that other powers will learn about this, other powers that might wish Israel ill will, and adapt to that for their own potential strikes in the future.
Haaretz, which you and I read, reports that contrary to Israeli censors, it leaked out that 33,000 applications have been made for building reconstruction from and after the Iranian attack. Now, that wouldn't be a total, I'll use Trump's phrase, obliteration of buildings, but it would be a material and substantial damage to the point where they're looking to the government for funds with which to reconstruct. Why would the Israelis drop a 500-pound bomb on an internet cafe in Gaza?
Because they are in the process of committing a genocide. And when a country is committing a genocide, that's exactly what you would expect. This is not surprising. I mean, you read the news every day, you know what they're doing. I mean, just think about the slaughter that's taking place at these various feeding sites that they've created.
Yeah, what he's referring to is IDF soldiers are shooting and killing Palestinians in line waiting for food and water and aid at various stations. I think over 600 have died in these types of attacks, and the Israeli government has even admitted this. They've caught some of it on tape of this happening. And, this is nothing new for this genocide. They've taken out Rafah, one of the biggest metropolises in Gaza. I think it is the biggest metropolis in Gaza, basically clearing out city blocks, reducing it to rubble, turning it into parking lots, and then children are plucked out of the rubble. And, we're just supposed to sit back and be like, oh, Israel has a right to defend itself. It's just wild that the U.S. bankrolls this nonsense. And what does Trump do in the middle of all this? Well, he compliments Netanyahu, asks the Knesset to drop all corruption and fraud charges against him, which I hope he goes down for, by the way, if not going down for war crimes, which I think I'll never pay for, unfortunately. But he deserves to go down like the worst of them for what he's done.
Right? They're starving the Palestinians and forcing them to go to these collection points where they get food. And then when they get there, they murder them. Given that that's been happening day after day, and somewhere between 50 and 100 Palestinians are being killed every day, I find it hardly surprising that they would drop a bomb on a cafe.
Yeah, and they're not isolated incidents, right? This is not one of these things that happen once. This is a continual strategy to kill Palestinians. He's absolutely right about this. Even corporate media has covered this in the United States to some extent.
It's all part of the genocide.
Are you surprised that Israeli settlers in the West Bank are engaged in violence against the IDF? Israeli settlers fighting violently with guns against the Israeli military?
No, not at all, because I think the Israeli military likes to put some limits on what the settlers can do. Their ultimate goals are the same, the settlers and the IDF. But the IDF has certain rules that they believe apply to the settlers. But the settlers don't believe any rules apply to them, and they can do whatever they want. And a lot of them are crazy enough that they're willing to attack the IDF. So you have this ongoing problem in the West Bank where the settlers and the IDF are actually clashing. And the Israeli Defense Ministry is taking measures to try to put this problem to bed.
Yeah, he's right about that. The settlers are actually in an interesting position too, because Israel actually has very strict gun control relative to the United States for sure. But in the settlements, in the West Bank settlements, the gun control restrictions are loosened incredibly so that the settlers can own guns, and that, puts one into having leverage in these types of situations much more so than someone that was disarmed. So you can see how that kind of plays into it too.
Why is Benjamin Netanyahu coming to Washington next week? We already give him everything he wants.
Well, I would imagine that he wants to strategize with Trump. Trump thought that this whole operation was a one and done. He thought that he would go in there, or we would go in there. We would obliterate Iran's nuclear capability, and that would be the end of the story. But what Trump doesn't understand is he just bought into a forever war. This war is going to go on and on and on. I can lay out the details as to how it's going to happen if you want. But the idea that this is one and done is not serious. So what Netanyahu wants to do is he wants to brief Trump on how this is likely to play out. and he wants to begin to work on getting him to make sure that the United States is in the fight with Israel.
Yeah, I can't underestimate how much I agree with Mearsheimer here. I've said this in various other videos, but what happened essentially solves nothing. It's only a matter of time until the Israel lobby and Netanyahu and the neocons clamor for war with Iran. They're going to be weeks away from acquiring a nuke again. I think even the Pentagon's acknowledged that, they can start enriching uranium within a year. And I think it's likely to be earlier than that because it seems like a lot of the uranium was taken out of Fordow before it was bombed, at least one of the 3 facilities. So yeah, Mearsheimer's on target here. This is part of a long-lasting forever war, not unlike, I think, what we got involved in the other regime change wars, like Syria especially in that war, but also Libya to some extent, Iraq to some extent, and Afghanistan to some extent, all on behalf of the Israel lobby. Remember, Iran has no capacity to threaten the United States. All this talk about mushroom clouds above New York is garbage. They have no delivery mechanism to do that. And they showed remarkable restraint in their reprisal attack, which even if you could call it that because they tipped Trump off to it and essentially saved lives. This disrupted the neocon and Zionist claim that they would try to just wipe Israel off the map and kill as many U.S. soldiers as they could because they didn't want a war with the U.S. Who would? They're in a position where they're trying to avert regime change, but that's all that's being placed on the table by Netanyahu and the Israel lobby.
How do you think the war will progress? Israel will break the ceasefire, as it always does whenever it enters into a ceasefire.
Well, again, you want to understand what Israel's goals are here. Israel's goal is to wreck Iran. It's to turn Iran into another Syria. And at the same time, to eliminate Iran's ability to enrich uranium. We focus a lot of attention on the fact that Iran can enrich uranium and that the Israelis and the Americans want to prevent that. Okay, but that's the first part of the story. The second part of the story is that the Israelis are bent on destroying Ukraine. They just don't want regime change.
Well, you said Ukraine, you meant Iran.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
They want to wreck Iran, and it's going to take them a while to do that. It took them a while to wreck Syria. Of course, they did it with our help and with Turkey's help. And their belief is that they can wreck Iran, but they can only do it with our help. You want to remember that one thing that's really happened here is that the Israelis have become extremely dependent on the United States to carry out these various military operations. The Israelis used to make a lot of the fact that they had created the ability to operate independently against their principal adversaries. They didn't need another country to fight their wars for them.
Yeah, I wish that were true.
Yes, they would buy weaponry from countries in Europe or from the United States. They would take aid from those countries. But when it was time to fight, the Israelis would do the fighting themselves. That's no longer the case. And it's in large part because the United States and Israel are joined at the hip. And because we're joined at the hip, they understand, right, that anytime they go to war against a country like Iran or when they execute a genocide in Gaza, they need the United States. They can't do it alone.
Yeah, they proved that in this last strike versus Iran is that, bombing strikes and taking out these residential complexes, this decapitation campaign they engaged in isn't enough for regime change. And Mearsheimer's totally right, too, about how Syria is essentially the model. Even though Netanyahu has said he wants the Libya model to apply in Iran, that was a regime change operation led by a U.S.-backed NATO alliance, offensive alliance, by the way. It's actually that they want it to be more like Syria. But the problem for Israel is that there's no outspoken rebel group within Iran through which to back, like the U.S. did in Operation Timber Sycamore, which U.S. aid dumped $15 billion in to depose Assad. That didn't quite happen back when it was happening and the U.S. was funding it, but they did finally get that regime change late last year, I believe in December. But you know who the U.S. was aiding in that war? The rebel group that stood up to Assad at that point? Al-Qaeda. And guess what else happened? John McCain went over there to take pictures with Al-Qaeda leaders, some of which fought alongside their brethren against U.S. soldiers in Iraq. And guess who was among their leaders? Jilani, also known as al-Shara. He was known as al-Shara back then. He's now the leader of Syria. He headed al-Nusra and also ISIS at some point, and he's now the leader of the country. That's what happened in Syria. Now they're executing Christians, and, it doesn't seem to be a great momentous change from the perspective of someone that actually cares about defending the United States essentially the only time it's been attacked in my lifetime, and that was in 9/11. So that's where we're at here, and Mearsheimer's totally right. Israel's joined at the hip of the U.S., and because of that, they get away with all this bellicose activity in the Middle East that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do. They could not sell this, they couldn't justify it, and it would leave them totally vulnerable without all this U.S. aid and assistance, and I think it's criminal, and the U.S. needs to stop it now.
And therefore, it makes eminently good sense for Netanyahu to come to Washington to talk sweetly to Donald Trump, to assuage his ego and tell him how much Israel needs him, how much Israel appreciates him, and also just to give him a sense of what's coming. Because you want to understand, Judge, what's happened here is that they've not obliterated forever Iran's nuclear capability. And Iran is committed to, once again, enriching uranium, right? That means that we won't know what exactly they're doing, because the IAEA, which has been our eyes and ears up to now, is no longer going to be able to monitor what the Iranians are doing.
And guess how also that could have been avoided? If you would actually follow through with creating a new JCPOA, which Iran was willing to do, by the way, but Trump shelved that, favoring Netanyahu and his stupid perilous strike instead. So yeah, Mearsheimer's right. They're going to enrich uranium again, and they would do that regardless if they wanted to build a nuclear weapon or not, which now I think they're very incentivized to do based on what's happened, based on how the U.S. treats North Korea, and that's where we're at. So yeah, Mearsheimer's totally right on this.
So the Israelis are going to tell all sorts of stories how the Iranians are secretly enriching uranium for purposes of building a bomb.
Yeah.
And we won't have Rafael Grossi or anyone like that there to say that they're not doing that.
That's right. That's the worst thing about this is now there's not even going to be an IAEA inspection regime. There's not going to be a U.S.-led inspection regime like we had there in 2015 to 2018 until Trump shredded the JCPOA, the only good foreign policy, item that Obama ever accomplished in my mind. He was a disaster on foreign policy, but that's something that actually normalized relations between the U.S. and Iran for some time, and they were complying with every single inspection. Now we're not going to know, and they're going to exploit that for new propaganda, for new military strikes and new regime change, and the U.S. is going to get dragged in again. It's already dragged in, and I don't know that there's any way to get out of it unless the U.S. turns face on this policy of favoring Israel at the expense of everything else, at the expense of America. It's make Israel great again. This is MEGA, Israel first.
And the Israelis won't have Rafael Grossi to share secrets, to get secrets from.
Yes, I fully understand that. But I'm also just telling you that you want to understand that from Israel's point of view, this is the ideal situation because the Israelis can portray the Iranians as moving rapidly down the road to get nuclear weapons. And there will be no IAEA to inspect and say that's not the case. And once that rhetoric is on the table and it begins to spread in the United States, as it did just before the bombing on June 22nd, what will happen is that we will feel compelled to come to the aid of our close ally, Israel. And of course,
close ally, put quotation marks there, close ally, because they benefit immeasurably from U.S. aid. Actually, they really don't. Their people suffer in language because of how preposterous their government acts, but they get all of that aid. And what benefit does the U.S. get? Nothing. That's what Candace Owens asked Piers Morgan. What's a benefit that the United States gets from its alliance with Israel? Nothingness. deflection, change the topic. Same thing with Tucker and Ted Cruz when Tucker asked Ted Cruz that question. No answers. There's literally nothing.
If we bomb again, that's not going to solve the problem. And all of this is a way of saying we're in another forever war.
What has the
Yeah.
United States of America as a country gained from its alliance with Israel?
Nothing, as I've said to you before. Israel is
Amen.
a giant albatross around their neck, both strategically and morally. I mean, as a result of what's going on in Gaza, we're complicit in a genocide. And from a strategic point of view, we're now in another forever war, this one involving Iran. Furthermore, it's more likely than ever that Iran is going to get nuclear weapons. And if that happens, it's going to do enormous damage to the NPT. Furthermore, supporting Israel the way we support it has done great damage to the international legal system that we set up. Just look at what we're doing with the ICC, the ICJ, and so forth and so on. So this is just terrible news for us. And as I like to emphasize, I know you're not happy to hear this, if you're interested in containing China, this is disastrous. You're running down all sorts of military stockpiles in this war in the Middle East, and of course in the Ukraine war as well. You're weakening yourself in East Asia, making it more difficult to contain China. So this is not good for us.
Yeah, I have to agree with that with Mearsheimer. And we have some differences, myself and Mearsheimer, when it comes to policy toward China and, you know, the perceived threat of China. But what I will say is it's undeniable that this episode pushes, that this doesn't push Iran closer into the arms of China and into the arms of Russia, who, by the way, the U.S. is trying to negotiate right now with in Ukraine, supposedly. Because, you know, we haven't seen a dramatic shift in terms of policy there, though there was some news today that Trump seems to be willing to withhold some weapons now, again, that would be going to Ukraine otherwise, while the Biden funding still proceeds there. And, you know, we'll have to see what happens there. But Mearsheimer's totally right here. Israel's embedded in our intelligence community, literally and figuratively. We know that from, you know, the historical records, and most recently this, you know, came to be again in the briefing rooms where Mossad agents were present briefing Trump instead of U.S. intelligence personnel like Tulsi Gabbard, who seemed to have been completely removed from this entire episode. And I suspect it's because she had misgivings about this. Now, I do think that she's compromised to some extent because she was willing to tweet out that, oh, they're weeks away from a nuclear bomb, which doesn't seem to really comport too well with her earlier testimony back in March about how they don't have a nuclear bomb and they're nowhere near close to getting one. So that's what's true. We're tied at the hip of Israel. Mearsheimer said it. He was totally right about it. And that's the most unfortunate thing about our foreign policy, for the most part, especially in that theater. In the Middle East, that's completely the reason. The true America First mentality would hold that U.S. troops should be taken back home. Bring all of our troops back home. Shut down all foreign-based U.S. military bases. Stop the sanctions regime that you're trying to saddle upon Iran and countries like Russia. Trade with these countries and sow goodwill. Practice diplomacy and negotiation and trust, not duplicity, not proxy wars, not sanctions, not the run-of-the-mill U.S. foreign policy. America First would be Jefferson's foreign policy. And what he said in his inaugural address, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. That's what we should believe. But I want to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below. Is Mearsheimer right about the control that Israel exercises over our intelligence community? Let me know down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Andrew Napolitano too. His podcast is awesome, his show's great. And please consider becoming either a Patreon patron or a YouTube member. If you become a YouTube member, you actually have access exclusively to advanced viewing of all of my videos before they come out on YouTube. And I will bow to you in appreciation if you choose to support the channel that way. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.